Hi, and thank you for having me as part of your Congress. I really appreciate that I can take part, even in this remote format. Warm thanks also to the translators and everyone helping with this little entry of mine, this talk. I want to talk about my recent work briefly and how it intersects with the themes of the Congress and digital art. A new book co-edited by me and my colleague Thomas Dwozak is just out, Photography of the Scale. So I thought that I might talk around that book to address some of the themes of measure and quantity of images and scale, and how images become central as items that mediate between epistemology and aesthetics, as units of knowledge and as aesthetics. Alan Sekula talked a long time ago already about traffic in photographs, connecting the circulation of quantities of images to the history of modern money and capitalism, sort of a logistical way of understanding images already. In a similar way, we can continue to ask what are the links between images, data, and value in contemporary culture. But I'm running ahead of myself now. Let me give you some context to the topic and outline what I want to say about images, invisibility, and operations through this research context. So the project Operational Images and Visual Culture runs from 2019 to 2023, 5 years, and it's directed by me, but it also includes a total of 5 other researchers as well. We are located at FAMU, at the Academy of Performing Arts in Prague, and the project is funded by Czech Science Foundation. Operational images is, of course, a term that is picked up from the filmmaker artist Harun Farocki's work. Already in early 2000s, continuing his earlier cinematic works on military epistemology, labor and technological systems, Farocki used the term operational images to refer to images that primarily operate. Only secondarily they might represent something. His works, such as I Machine series, were addressing these peculiar kinds of technical images which had a history in photogrammetry, for instance, and other practices of measurement and targeting. And they were becoming the central type of image in military and other practices where vision was automated. While now machine vision systems are already integrated into multiple everyday uses, our project is investigating these intersections of contemporary visual and cultural theory through these images, both conceptually and through the practices of these images. And we're interested in what sorts of histories and conceptual themes emerge from a sustained engagement with operational images. A whole list would be difficult to give, but there's a couple of examples that we can start with. Example of operational images could be such imaging technologies and processes that typically couple cameras or sensors with some type of image processing software. Think of unmanned aerial vehicles, autonomous cars, industrial and home robots, medical imaging, MRI, CT or CAT scanners, industrial scanners, CCTVs, geographical information systems like digital maps and navigation. So a lot of ways in which navigation, operation, and multiple other, let's say, practices come together in this notion and practice of operational image. And of course, we can include a lot of artistic practices as well that in a way work with these themes. I'm thinking here, Hito style, Trevor Pagler, many other really familiar names. So the legacy of operational image is also part of our investigation and how it relates to contemporary AI and machine vision discussions and practices. What I want to do in this little talk is to address Trevor Paglen's by now quite a central take on what he calls invisible images. It came out in 2016, and in that brief text, he outlined the question, how do we deal with visual culture that operates outside the ability to see images? Images circulate in mass quantities and increasingly only between machines, so that it really forces a shift in both practices of what we do with these images, machine vision to AI, to data sets that feed as AI training sets. And how do we think about perception and perceptual capacities? Catherine Hales has talked about the planetary cognitive ecology in similar terms, referring to the semiotic processes that are not merely a replication of what human semiosis means. Cybersemiosis, in Hales's terms, is the challenge of us trying to understand technical mediations. I would say, for example, images, as they are circulating across machine environments from image and other sensors through hardware, software systems, and platforms. So, Paglen's question and address concerning invisible images seems to be of central concern. What are these kinds of standard images that are in traditional terms invisible? But they still operate on human bodies. They operate in urban situations. They operate in multiple other ways, a form of governance as well of these actionable images, images that take place and action in place and space. It also sets out against this backdrop that I was also outlining in the abstract of the talk. To visualize, to make visible, to make tangible seems to persist as central part of both practice and theory of digital culture at large, including critical practices. We want data to reveal patterns. We want to find the needle in the haystack of unstructured data. Surveillance is not the only modality or practice where this comes out, but it comes also in different sectors of data turned analytics. Images turned into patterns, and as such images that are closer to diagrams than traditional representational images. So a multitude of different approaches gravitate around the idea that making the invisible visible is key part of the critical arts and humanities, and also where our methodological investment should be in order to understand the realities that are not directly available to experience, or how power structures remain hidden in other ways, commercial, legal, other sorts of secrets, one could say, whether these are secrets in the traditional sense or secrets in the sense of legislation in capitalist culture. In Wendy Chun's words, the visibly invisible nature of digital culture, from interfaces to programming to data, persists as a key issue. Transparency and information opacity, referring to, for instance, here I'm thinking about Zach Blass's work, is another pair of terms that articulates related issues. But what forms of conceptualization and practice ensure that the visible-invisible pairing is not seen in simple oppositional terms, but it operates in complex ways in aesthetic and epistemic context? And there's another route as well. The centrality of invisible and standardization of scientific image to capture light spectra, to capture speeds and scales invisible to the human in these practices, was already one key trait before digital aesthetics. As historians of science have pointed out, most recently I've been engaging with Jimena Canales' wonderful book, 10th of a Second, which happens to be here now. Besides these rhetorics of invisible realities made visible, it's also about standardization of instruments of measurement that is part of the operational reality of these images. If we were now in the same space with you all, I would love to share and discuss many examples. One would be the wonderful images of, for instance, these wonderful images of airflows that Etienne Jules Marais pictured in the test situation in late 19th century, early 20th century, more than 100 years ago. A smoke machine, movement of air, photographing the turbulent patterns of airflows. Beautiful images. The 21st century version of this would be perhaps the projects and rhetoric of making the invisible air pollution visible in urban sensing and data visualization projects. That's pick up on similar epistemological terms, the invisible to visible, but in totally different material contexts, moved from photography to data. And there's a wealth of good work that emerged and is emerging on data and material epistemologies. I won't be doing a full overview at all, and I won't be able to talk about, for instance, cultural analytics. Many attempts at offering a new computational quantitative methodology are interesting, even if we argue in that book that is just now out, Photography of the Scale, with Edinburgh University Press. These need to be discussed also in conceptual terms. Quantitative as such is not sufficient. There is more at stake in such images than just counting them in quantities. The quantity becomes a pattern of knowledge with implications not only for aesthetics of digital culture, but also policy when it concerns these projects that tap into a multitude of social events. Indeed, air pollution or COVID patterns of spreading, making these sorts of relationalities visible, right? So there's a politics in this quantification as well. So, okay, scientific imaging has been in many ways a test bed for invisibility, but it also prescribes a complex ontology. For instance, my colleague Thomas Dvořák deals with this in relation to images and quantification and measure in his chapter in the book Photography of the Scale. And of course, then we could continue for a long time about big data. In much of big data and digital discourse, invisible as a term and as a concept, as an aim, as an epistemological marker, marks a spot. It has become addressable as an epistemological quality. It's not only that there are signs that take place of what was invisible, but that the invisible itself is a sign. Like once was said about the invention of zero to signify nothing, the note about invisibility has a vague quality of signifying something. It is that which must be out there to be known in here, on the surface of the image. And of course, there's so much into this as well that we want to sort of constantly investigate in different ways as well. It relates to Wendy Chun's observation about software in different ways. What she writes about software is this invisible system of visibility that surfaces at certain points, like the interface, for instance, only to play a game of double entendre, to conceal and unconceal, to perform ideology and ideology critique at the same time. Same could be said about data as well, of how it's obviously hovering between the unstructured masses of data that becomes visible as a pattern in visualization projects. But what does it feed into in terms of contemporary contexts? So one proposal that I want to introduce and briefly go through is that we should be shifting from invisibility of patterns in data to invisuality. So recently Adrian Mackenzie and Anna Munster proposed to think of invisual to define what they call platform seeing as a way of entering into this debate about data. This term shifts the focus from code and interface, even perception, to the platform that becomes a site of formatting and reformatting images, incorporating them into AI systems, and furthermore embedding platforms into various spatio-temporal situations. This is testified in contexts such as platform urbanism. So while the platform itself is an effective economic site of transactions, of capturing of value, describing digital effects much beyond the screen space, it also prescribes a role to what images mean as a refiguring of not what is visible, but what is operative. What can be formatted, reconfigured, established as effective relations, where this space of images starts to refer to pattern recognition of relations, not images in traditional sense at all. An integration of this new form and quantities of images, not just aggregation or seeing differently, but the whole platform logic in which it becomes operationalized. So the platform itself, as has been argued by many, is a techno-social formation with capacities to capture value, reproduce social patterns. It introduces new forms of valuation based on relations, and it also works in and through images in ways that is significant for understanding the transformation of the horizon of the invisible to that of invisual. They argue that the abundance of images and their operations in contemporary platforms produces a radical detachment from the usual tropes of seeing. Platform functions as a site of aggregation of images, but it doesn't amount merely to observing this quantitative sense in circulation and aggregation, again, point we also make in photography of the scale. For Mackenzie and Munster, this goes as far as challenging the trope of making visible the invisible, that features in their words in data science, data-inflected design, and big data-driven commerce, and instead focuses on operations of and upon the image that happens through the platform. So platforms from Facebook to multiple Chinese platforms to specialized scientific and engineering innovation platforms are then a complex site of platformating of input images that come in through devices, sensors, and other places. Takes place, this input images are being formatted, but also how this feeds into a very abstract sense of predictive diagrams that operate upon the world. In other words, this could be also one form of a description of the pipeline or logistics of AI systems, images, training sets, training for models which operate upon the world in different machine vision systems. These are non-representational operations. They are not, according to this argument, merely things either visible or invisible, perceived or imperceived, but they are constantly sorted and processed upon massive scale. That the observation of these events is not on the scale of one image, but a whole collection and an ensemble. The ensemble, the collection, the data set, the training model takes precedence in how images feature a series of relations. Again, I'm thinking a bit about secular traffic in photographs, but also in massive data scales. Mackenzie and Munster argue that describing this in terms of invisuality cuts across and rearranges typical contrasts between elements of perception. The eye or the lens, sensor, perhaps even file, screen, and database. We rearrange these terms. None of these is sufficient in their own right to understand where this observation is when the platform takes priority in arranging images into operational complex. Invisuality is at the heart of platform seeing, where relation between images is a core feature instead of their singular existence, let alone representation. For instance, in this case then, there is no data visualization if that implies making the invisible visible. There's only a set of practices and a layer of production of relation that produces its own opacities in the epistemological sense. The pipeline of sensing is not simply from the invisible to the visible, from imperceived to perceived, but in this interesting distributed meshwork of events of sensing, where the platform is the integrating, connecting factor with its own legal, commercial implications. As scholarship on camera phones and similar image devices has shown, platforms are already embedded in the workings of taking an image, to an extent that from the image sensor onwards, all is already on, or at least in relation to the platform as a site that scales. So as Mackenzie and Munster put it, and I quote, a device then becomes another location for the generation of image ensembles. So of course this is super interesting for multiple reasons, because if the device is a location for the generation of image ensembles, the device itself is in a location, and the platform is in multiple locations as it reformats, for instance, the city and various other spatial and spatio-temporal locations. So you see how the scale of this becomes really interesting in terms of what it means in urban and non-urban situations. So in their words, this is not about generation of images in the simple sense anymore. It is a whole logistics of procedures, of standards and resolutions, but also various forms of prediction and forecasts, models trained on datasets of images, seeing, observing, knowing, all circulate in ways that becomes layered on the world. And images are part of this process of layering. How I read this is that the question of images is about operational spheres, a term that reminds of particular military discourse, as Farocchi hinted, but also Jimena Canales in another text of hers, where she refers to operational aesthetics. This operational sphere and aesthetic is not about seeing or not seeing, or the phenomenological language of visible or invisible, but it's about organization and logistics. So coming full circle, we end up with operations again. What I have briefly presented is only a small part, a snippet of what I'm working on at the moment. A book I'm writing on operational images, as well as some other projects where the term is mobilized outside and beyond its original uses. For example, with my colleague Abelardo Gil Fournier, we prepared a commissioned video called Seed Image Ground, where the video essay format, we use that to detail different use of the operational image, not merely the trope of invisibility in technical images, but also the ways it relates to operations upon the ground, from agriculture to cinematic surveys of territories, and you are able to find that online as well, Seed Image Ground. But for this talk, I thank you. I will finish here, and I hope to be in dialogue with you all in some context or another. Thank you.